Ever heard of Paracelsus? Maybe you've come across his name in a history book, or even something a little more esoteric, like a book on, say, the occult.
He's a figure shrouded in mystery, a real blend of legend and historical fact, and that's what makes him so fascinating to explore.
Paracelsus, the Renaissance alchemist and physician, is who we're diving deep into today.
And a good place to start is with when he was born, 1493, the same year Columbus is believed to have reached the Americas.
Wow. Talk about being born in an age of change.
Hmm.
The Renaissance was in full swing, the world was expanding, and then along comes Paracelsus.
But he wasn't your typical Renaissance man, was he?
He didn't exactly fit the mold, did he?
Not at all. Brilliant, yes. But he seemed to make it his mission to clash with just about every authority figure out there, whether it was the church or the scientific establishment.
So he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, even back then.
Not one bit. I mean, he believed in God, sure, but he wasn't afraid to question the church's, shall we say, reluctance to embrace scientific inquiry.
He saw the value in both faith and reason, which I imagine was a pretty radical stance back in the 16th century.
It really was. He seemed to understand that the pursuit of knowledge, whether through faith or through reason, were both valuable pursuits. But he didn't stop there.
Oh, no.
Paracelsus also believed that scientists, in their endless pursuit of knowledge, were kind of missing the bigger picture.
How so?
He thought they were getting too caught up in the how and why of the natural world and forgetting about the spiritual dimension, the divine in it all. He was always pushing those boundaries, always questioning.
A true independent thinker. Which reminds me of that quote attributed to him. Let no man belong to another who can belong to himself.
That quote right there, that's Paracelsus in a nutshell.
It really speaks to his independent spirit, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That independent streak, that unwillingness to be put in a box, that was at the core of who he was. And it really comes through in everything he did, from his medical practices to his writings on alchemy.
Speaking of his writings, they're quite something, aren't they?
As complex and enigmatic as the man himself.
It's like they defy categorization.
They really do. They're this fascinating blend of alchemy, medicine, theology, you name it, it's in there. It's no wonder they continue to fascinate and mystify people, even to this day.
And he even invented his own words to express his ideas, which is incredible.
Right. Talk about being ahead of your time.
There's this other quote from him that I find really intriguing. Pray, seek, knock, and it will be open to you by God, and all you need will be given to you in excess, because it is in his name and through him that all things occur.
Powerful stuff.
What I want to know is, what kind of knowledge did he possess that made him believe it could only come from a divine source?
That's a fantastic question. It gets right at the heart of Paracelsus's worldview.
That there's a spiritual dimension to knowledge, that true understanding, especially about healing, is a gift.
Exactly. He saw the divine in everything. And that's especially true when it came to his medical practice. Because let me tell you, Paracelsus was anything but a traditional doctor.
Oh, I think we have time to get into that. From what I've read, his approach to medicine was pretty revolutionary, even dangerous.
You could definitely say that. To really understand just how radical his ideas were, we have to rewind a bit, go back to the 16th century.
Set the scene for us. What did the medical landscape look like back then?
Just imagine. It's the 16th century and you're not feeling so well, but instead of actual diagnoses and, treatments that might actually help, you've got doctors blaming your ailments on your bodily fluids being out of whack.
Out of whack bodily fluids.
That was the prevailing theory. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was cutting-edge medical science.
Out of whack bodily fluids. So what did that even mean exactly?
Okay, so picture this. They believed that our bodies were governed by these four humors, right? Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
Okay.
And if these humors were in balance, you were healthy. But if they got out of whack...
That's when the trouble started.
You got it. Illness. And their methods for restoring this balance, well, let's just say they weren't exactly what we call gentle today.
You're telling me.
Like, what did they do?
Bloodletting was all the rage, leeches, purging... You name it, they probably cried it.
It's amazing anyone survived to see the Renaissance at that rate.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But you have to remember, this is the world. Paracelsus was born into a world steeped in these, well, let's be honest, pretty barbaric medical practices. But Paracelsus, he wasn't content to just accept the status quo. Remember that quote about knowledge being a gift from God?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Paracelsus truly believed he was divinely guided to revolutionize medicine.
Wow. He really was an iconoclast, wasn't he? Challenging centuries of medical tradition, rejecting the very foundation on which it was built. Exactly. See, Paracelsus believed that physical diseases, they had physical causes, not these mystical imbalances or evil spirits.
It seems like common sense now, but that was a radical idea back then.
Oh, absolutely. He was talking about things like toxic substances, infections, real, tangible causes we'd recognize today. But back then, people were used to blaming illness on bad air or a curse. Paracelsus was a game changer.
So what did he do? Did Paracelsus try to convince these doctors they had it all wrong?
He was known to be pretty, how should we put it, confrontational with those who clung to the old ways. There are stories of him actually burning medical textbooks, claiming he learned more from observing the natural world than from any dusty old book.
I love that. Okay, so he's challenging centuries of dogma. But what did he offer in its place?
This is where it gets really interesting because this is where Paracelsus, the alchemist, the mystic, really comes into play.
All right, alchemy. So we're talking bubbling potions and turning lead into gold.
Not quite, or at least not in the way you might think. Paracelsus wasn't interested in creating material wealth. For him, alchemy was a path to understanding the hidden forces of nature. He believed that to truly heal the body, you had to work in harmony with those forces.
That's pretty profound when you think about it. So how did this alchemical worldview actually play out in his practice?
Well, this is where the idea of the microcosm and macrocosm comes in.
I've heard that term before, but I'll admit, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
It's a fascinating concept. Basically, Paracelsus believed that the human body was a reflection of the universe as a whole, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm.
So what does that mean in terms of, like, treating illnesses?
It means that to understand the complexities of the human body, you had to understand the elements and forces that govern the universe. And that's where his theory of the tria prima comes in.
The tria prima.
Instead of the classic four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, Paracelsus proposed three primary substances: salt, sulfur, and mercury.
Salt, sulfur, and mercury. Those sound like ingredients for something straight out of a medieval alchemist's workshop. Not exactly what I'd expect to find in a doctor's bag.
You're not wrong. Paracelsus wasn't afraid to blur the lines between what we might consider magic and medicine today, but for him, these weren't just random ingredients plucked from some ancient spell book.
They had a deeper meaning.
Absolutely. These were powerful substances, each one representing a fundamental principle. Salt for the physical body, sulfur for the soul, and mercury, the most elusive, representing the spirit.
So by understanding how these principles, these substances, interacted within the body and out in the world, you could unlock the secrets to healing.
You've got it. And this is where Paracelsus really sets himself apart from the doctors of his day. He was a pioneer in using minerals and metals in his treatments, substances that most physicians at the time wouldn't have dared to touch.
Like what? Give us some examples.
We're talking about mercury, arsenic, even gold. He believed that by carefully preparing and administering these substances, you could actually target very specific ailments.
I can only imagine that raised a few eyebrows back then.
Yeah.
Weren't some of those substances considered, a little on the dangerous side?
That's an understatement. And that's something that's often overlooked when people talk about Paracelsus. Yes, he was ahead of his time in recognizing the potential healing power of these substances, but he also wasn't afraid to work with things that were known to be highly toxic.
A bit of a double-edged sword.
Precisely. And that duality, that tension between the brilliant and the dangerous, it really sums up Paracelsus as a whole, doesn't it? He was a fascinating tangle of contradictions. A mystic and a scientist, a rebel and a healer.
He was a man who seemed to defy easy categorization, which is probably why he continues to fascinate us even today, centuries later.
500 years later, we're still talking about him and still trying to unravel the mysteries of his life and work.
So what do you think is Paracelsus's most important legacy? What is it about him that continues to resonate with us today?
That's a tough one. I think for me, it's his unwavering belief in the power of questioning. He refused to be bound by tradition or dogma, whether it was religious or scientific. He looked at the world with a critical eye and wasn't afraid to say, I think there might be a better way.
He reminds us that real progress, real innovation can't happen if we're afraid to challenge the status quo, to go against the grain, even if it ruffles a few feathers along the way.
And Paracelsus was never one to shy away from a little controversy. But more importantly, he reminds us to never stop asking questions, to always be pushing those boundaries, seeking deeper truths, even, or perhaps especially, in the face of opposition.
It makes you wonder what he'd make of the world today, doesn't it? I mean, if Paracelsus could see how far we've come in terms of medicine, our understanding of the human body.
Would he be impressed? Or would he be shaking his head at how much we still haven't figured out? I have a feeling it would be a little bit of both.
He'd probably be out there giving lectures, challenging the latest scientific theories, writing books that no one could quite categorize, and maybe even still brewing up a few controversial concoctions in his lab.
That sounds about right. Paracelsus, the ever-evolving enigma.
So, was he a genius, a madman, a visionary? I think that's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But one thing's for sure. Paracelsus left an indelible mark on the world, and his story continues to challenge and inspire us centuries later.